Okay, we're about to dive into one of the most incredible and honestly tragic pieces of American history, one that almost nobody knows about.
So let me ask you a question. What's America's worst maritime disaster? Go ahead, think about it. For pretty much everyone, the first thing that pops into your head is a giant iceberg and a supposedly unsinkable ship, right?
Well, that's what we all think. But you know what? That answer is wrong. The deadliest maritime disaster in all of American history happened decades before the Titanic, and it wasn't in the middle of the ocean. It was right on the Mississippi River, and it's a tragedy that was born from greed, corruption, and just the sheer chaos at the end of a long, brutal war.
1,167. Just let that number sink in for a second. That is the latest historian-verified death toll. To put that into perspective for you, that's more people than were lost on the Titanic. And yet, for over 150 years, this story has been almost completely forgotten.
So to really understand how something this catastrophic could even happen, we have to go back in time. We're talking April of 1865. The whole country was in a state of absolute turmoil.
The Civil War had just ground to a halt, but the nation was completely reeling from President Lincoln's assassination. And right in the middle of all this chaos, thousands of Union prisoners of war, guys who were basically skeletons, sick from being in horrific camps like Andersonville, were being released. They're all gathering in Vicksburg, Mississippi, with just one single, desperate thought on their minds. I gotta get home.
And you know, that kind of desperation, it creates an opportunity. And in this case, it was an opportunity for a deadly bargain, fueled by pure, simple greed. And here's where it all goes wrong. It comes down to some really simple, corrupt math. See, the government was paying steamboat captains for every single soldier they took north. So this quartermaster in Vicksburg, a guy named Reuben Hatch, goes up to Captain James Mason of the Steamboat Sultana, and he makes him an offer. I'll make sure you get a massive load of soldiers, if you give me a little kickback.
And this quote, it just says it all about Captain Mason. The guy was known for being a fast captain, super reckless, always pushing his boats to the absolute limit. He'd even been caught smuggling for the Confederacy. Not because he believed in their cause, but because he was loyal to whoever paid him the most. So of course, he jumped at Hatch's deal.
Now his partner in crime, this Reuben Hatch fella, might have been even worse. This guy had a long history of corruption. We're talking skimming money from military contracts for horses, for lumber, you name it. But he was connected. I mean, really connected. He was a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln. So every time he got caught, his powerful buddies would get him off the hook. He was the perfect guy to set up this whole deadly scheme.
So you have this corrupt deal in place. What happens next? Well, it leads directly to a series of catastrophic technical failures that basically turn the Sultana into a floating time bomb.
Okay, so here's how it went down. Just south of Vicksburg, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers springs a really dangerous leak. Now, a proper repair would have taken days, and Captain Mason knew he'd lose all that money. So he just ordered a quick and dirty patch job. That was problem number 1. Problem number 2 was the crew. They had this reckless habit of running the water levels in the boilers really low to get more speed. And finally, the boat itself was listing, leaning way over because of the insane number of men on board. So when it leaned one way, water sloshed away from the red-hot boiler metal. And when it leaned back, that cold water would hit that superheated steel and bam! Instantly flash into explosive steam. A chain reaction was pretty much guaranteed at that point.
And if you want to understand just how criminal this whole situation was, you just have to look at the numbers. The Sultana's legal capacity was 376 people. 376. On its last trip, it was carrying over 2,100 souls. That's nearly 6 times its limit. The decks were so overloaded they were actually sagging, and they had to prop them up with extra wooden beams. It's just unbelievable.
And this is just haunting. Just one day before the disaster, the Sultana stops in Helena, Arkansas, and a photographer captures this image. He knew he was seeing something historic, a record-breaking number of people on one boat. He had no idea how tragic that history was about to become. I mean, just look at it. Every single inch of that boat is covered by a person.
And here's the crazy thing. Despite the awful, cramped conditions, the mood on board was joyous. These guys had survived the Civil War, they had survived these brutal prison camps, they were finally going home. As one soldier later wrote, they were so close they could almost feel their family's arms around them. They truly believed the worst was over. 2 in the morning, April 27th, 1865. After everything they had been through,
They were just hours from home, from safety. And then, in the middle of the night, 7 miles north of Memphis, on a pitch-black, flooded Mississippi River, the unthinkable happened.
Section 4, Catastrophe on the Mississippi. All of it, the faulty boiler, the low water, the dangerously listing boat, it all came to a head. The floating bomb finally went off.
The explosion was just apocalyptic. 3 of the 4 boilers detonated. They blew a massive hole in the ship, completely vaporizing the pilot house where the captain and crew were. The giant smokestacks came crashing down, crushing hundreds of men. The collapsing decks created this horrifying funnel, just sliding hundreds more trapped soldiers right into the exposed, red-hot furnaces of the ship. So the survivors, they had this impossible choice: burn alive on this floating inferno or jump into the freezing, flood-swollen river, a river that most of them, weak and emaciated from prison, had no strength to swim in.
And in the middle of all this horror, there's this one detail that's just bizarre. So the ship had a mascot, a 7-foot alligator that was kept in a wooden crate, and it actually survived the first blast. Apparently, one survivor stabbed the gator, dumped it out, and used its crate as a life raft to float to safety. You can't make this stuff up.
So you have to ask, right? How could the worst maritime disaster in American history, a story with this much tragedy, this much obvious corruption, how could it just fade away? And why was no one ever really held responsible?
Well, believe it or not, the answer really comes down to the news cycle. The entire country was completely obsessed with the final, dramatic events of the war. Just the day before the Sultana exploded, Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was cornered and killed. A couple of weeks after that, the Confederate President Jefferson Davis was captured. Against these huge, earth-shattering headlines, the Sultana disaster, even with its insane death toll, was just quickly pushed off the front page. It was literally buried by history.
And as for accountability, there was pretty much none. Captain Mason, he died in the explosion he helped create. One lower-level officer was made the fall guy, found guilty, and then his conviction was just quietly overturned. And Reuben Hatch, the corrupt mastermind, the guy who orchestrated this whole thing for a bribe, he just quit the army and vanished. Never punished, not one bit.
So what's the big takeaway here? You know, the story of the Sultana is so much more than just a shipwreck. It's this haunting lesson in how unchecked greed always leads to tragedy, how justice can get completely buried by the headlines of the day, and how the stories of ordinary people, in this case soldiers who had already been through hell, can be so easily and tragically forgotten.
And in this final kind of poignant twist, the Mississippi River has changed its course so much over the last century and a half that the wreck of the Sultana, it isn't even in the river anymore. It's buried 20 feet deep under a quiet soybean field in Arkansas, a forgotten disaster resting in a forgotten grave.